I was penciling a small correction into an old hymn arrangement. I had no particular reason to revise that evening. An old habit from 45 years spent directing a church choir. When I sat in the back pew of my own sanctuary during a milestone anniversary service and read, in the printed program handed to me at the door, that the celebration honored the choir's remarkable revival under our new director, with my own name appearing only once in a single line describing the ministry's founding decades earlier. I remember folding that program slowly, my own pencil still tucked behind one ear. Right before that single sentence rearranged the entire shape of that evening. I had no idea that my daughter-in-law had spent nearly 3 years quietly becoming the ministry's sole public face, and that within the following week, I would formally notify the church's own music committee that every original arrangement I had personally composed for that choir, dozens of pieces still central to its weekly repertoire, was no longer available for the ministry's continued use. My name is Araminta Fenmore. I'm 76 years old. I spent 45 years directing a church choir, the kind of calling that teaches you that a piece of music, even one written quietly for a small congregation rather than any wider audience, still belongs entirely to the person who actually composed it, and teaches you, too, that handing someone the baton temporarily is an entirely different thing from handing them ownership of everything that baton has ever conducted. My husband Solomon died 6 years ago. A sudden stroke while tuning our own church's pipe organ, the kind of ordinary Saturday morning maintenance that gave no warning at all. I remember hearing the organ go suddenly, jarringly silent, and running up to the loft to find him already slumped over the console he'd maintained faithfully for decades. Grief that arrives in the middle of caring for an instrument you both loved teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the sound of an organ warming up can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn, slowly, to keep directing anyway, because the alternative is letting an entire ministry's music go untended. I took over our small church's choir 45 years ago when it consisted of barely 6 volunteers, singing from a thin, borrowed hymnal. And over the following decades, I built it deliberately and patiently into something considerably larger, composing dozens of original arrangements specifically suited to our own congregation's particular voices and our own sanctuary's particular acoustics. Music that existed nowhere else because I had written it specifically for this exact community. I registered formal copyright on the more significant original compositions decades ago, understanding even then that music written with genuine care deserved the same protection any other creative work would receive. After Solomon died, continuing that ministry, exactly the way we'd built it together, became something closer to sacred to me. The clearest remaining trace of decades spent building something meaningful in partnership with him. Solomon and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a piano tuner and organ technician for nearly 50 years, meticulous with every reed and pipe, the kind of man who could hear a single instrument drift a fraction out of tune weeks before anyone else in the congregation noticed. When I told him, 3 years into our marriage, that I wanted to take over directing our small church's struggling choir rather than simply sing in it, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with 2 small children at home. He told me he'd handle every rehearsal night's dinner and bedtime, and he did for decades without complaint. I built my own ministry slowly after that, the way most honest callings get built, one carefully composed arrangement at a time, 45 years in that choir loft, until I finally began scaling back with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young singer early in my own tenure, a woman convinced she'd never develop the confidence to carry a solo line in front of the congregation, whom I spent an entire season quietly coaching after our shared rehearsals, never once mentioning to the church council how much extra time it actually required. She went on to direct her own church choir at a considerably larger congregation for over 2 decades. And years later, a letter arrived, thanking me for refusing to let her give up on her own voice. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my calling, long before I ever imagined needing that same instinct applied to protecting my own composed legacy. I have 2 children. Marceline, my daughter, is a hospital chaplain, 3 time zones away, gentle and exacting in exactly the way you'd hope someone in that particular calling would be. She calls every Sunday evening, without fail, a habit that started the year Solomon died and never once lapsed since. My son Anselm is 42, a church administrator himself, married for 7 years to a woman named Verity Lindqvist, 35, whose growing career as a professional choral director he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making her own professional ambition sound like natural, generous succession. Verity grew up in a musical family that valued visible, individual achievement considerably more than the patient. Collaborative work of building something over decades. The kind of household where a compelling personal narrative about artistic revival mattered more than honestly acknowledging the actual foundation such a revival was built upon. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's hunger for a compelling origin story comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep feeding that hunger forever, especially once it starts consuming decades of your own actual composed work. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Anselm, back when we still spoke easily and often, about her own mother's habit of describing every community orchestra she'd ever played in as an ensemble she'd personally helped rebuild from near collapse, regardless of how many other musicians had actually kept it running the whole time. My mom always said a good revival story gets you noticed considerably faster than an honest one about steady, ongoing work, she told me, laughing. I grew up believing that framing myself as the person who saved something mattered more than accurately describing whose steady work had actually kept it alive all along. I remember thinking at the time that it reflected a genuinely savvy understanding of how careers actually get built. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around claiming revival rather than honoring continuity, and that a ministry I'd spent 45 years steadily building would eventually become the thing that framework was applied to, without my consent. My own days, in the years since Solomon died, had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. Coffee at my own kitchen table most mornings, an hour or 2 working through a new arrangement, at my own piano out of habit as much as need. The occasional call from a former choir member looking to catch up. It was, by most measures, a peaceful life, one I'd built carefully around a ministry I still loved, and one that made an ordinary Sunday service feel, at first, like nothing more than the usual quiet routine I'd kept for decades. Anselm met Verity at a diocesan music conference he'd attended for his own administrative work, and I remember the first time he brought her by our church, watching her listen to the choir rehearse one of my own original arrangements with genuine informed appreciation, asking thoughtful questions afterward about the specific compositional choices I'd made for our own particular voices. I remember thinking, watching that first visit, how naturally she seemed to understand exactly what made this small ministry's music actually work. I would think about that first visit considerably more, in a different light, once I understood how selectively that same understanding eventually got applied. About 3 years ago, following a health scare that made extended choir rehearsals considerably harder for me to manage alone, I brought Verity on as assistant director, genuinely grateful for her own formal musical training and eager to share the responsibility with someone I trusted completely, given her marriage into my own family. I did make clear with the church's own music committee that my own original compositions remained mine, protected by their existing copyright registration, and that any future change to my role or to the ministry's use of my own arrangements required my own direct, active approval. Everyone involved agreed readily to those terms. It would take nearly 3 years of careful, creeping erosion before I understood exactly how much that agreement was actually protecting. For the first year of our shared directorship, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Verity's own genuine musical talent bringing real energy to rehearsals. Our two approaches working together naturally. The choir itself responding warmly to the partnership. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was about 14 months in, when the church's own newsletter began describing the choir's recent artistic growth as Verity's fresh vision for the ministry, framing her own involvement as creative revival rather than accurately describing our actual shared directorship. I mentioned this to the newsletter's own editor, and the language was corrected promptly, though I noted with some discomfort that Verity hadn't mentioned the discrepancy to me herself before I discovered it independently. The second incident happened when I began needing to reduce my own rehearsal hours further, following a second, more serious health complication. And Verity offered to cover considerably more solo directing during my recovery. A genuinely reasonable and generous offer at the time that I accepted gratefully, never suspecting that solo coverage would gradually become something considerably more permanent than the temporary arrangement we'd actually discussed. The third incident happened when I discovered entirely by accident that Verity had been giving informal talks to visiting music educators from neighboring parishes, describing her own vision for the ministry's future direction, and discussing planned repertoire changes without ever mentioning that any use of my own copyrighted arrangements specifically would require my own direct approval. The fourth incident happened when I overheard Verity on a call with the diocese's own music office, discussing an upcoming regional recognition for the ministry in language that referred to the choir's entire repertoire as her own creative portfolio, a description that made no mention of the dozens of original pieces I had personally composed and still held copyright over. The fifth incident happened during a planning conversation for the choir's own upcoming anniversary service. Sitting in the church's own small meeting room with a program draft spread between us when Verity mentioned, almost as an aside, that, given my own continued health limitations, it might make more sense for the anniversary program itself to focus primarily on her own vision for the ministry's future rather than an extended retrospective of my own 45 years. Directing it. Araminta, you understand, right? She said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. It's not about erasing the history. It's just about what actually keeps the ministry feeling forward-looking. I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law discuss minimizing 45 years of my own actual work at the very service meant to celebrate it, as though decades of building this choir from 6 borrowed hymnals were an inconvenient retrospective rather than the very foundation any future the ministry might have was actually built upon. The sixth incident happened when Verity's own mother, meeting me at a family gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter step into such a significant ministry role with such natural confidence. She's always had that gift, she said, beaming for taking a small, quiet program and truly making it something people notice. I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else directly. Though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually understood how thoroughly my own 45 years of work were being quietly recategorized as raw material for someone else's fresh revival story. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something more directly and didn't. It happened when the diocese's own regional newsletter ran a brief feature describing the choir's remarkable recent artistic growth under Verity's leadership. Mentioning my own name only briefly as the program's original founder, rather than its continuing composer and co-director. I read that feature at my own kitchen table, Solomon's own organ tuning notes still tucked into a nearby drawer, understanding that my own decades of work had somehow already begun disappearing from the ministry's own public story before any actual formal transition had ever been agreed to. The eighth incident happened when I overheard Verity on a call with a music publisher exploring a possible collection of arrangements suitable for small church choirs, describing herself in that early exploratory conversation as the creator of a distinctive body of accessible choral work, language that made no mention of the fact that the actual arrangements under discussion were compositions I had written myself, decades before Verity had ever directed a rehearsal at all. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Verity is just building her own career the way ambitious musicians do. Anselm loves me, even if he doesn't correct her firmly enough. The choir is still technically mine, whatever the newsletter says, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that 45 years of my own actual composed work had become raw material in someone else's more marketable revival story. There was one afternoon, about 2 months before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to saying something. Verity called to ask whether I'd be comfortable if she handled the anniversary service's own primary remarks alone, framing the request as simple practicality, given my own limited stamina for extended public speaking at my own age. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for nearly 3 years. Then I thought about Anselm's own happiness, about how much this ministry had already come to mean to his wife's own sense of purpose, about how a fight over public credit would only ever complicate something he was genuinely proud of her for building. I agreed reluctantly and told myself, one more time, that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the anniversary service. I sat in the back pew that Sunday, having decided, given my own limited stamina, to simply attend as a member of the congregation rather than participate directly. And I read in the printed program handed to me at the door that the entire service was framed around celebrating the choir's remarkable revival under our new director. Extended remarks planned for Verity alone, my own name appearing only once, in a single line describing the ministry's founding decades earlier, in language that placed my own entire life's work firmly, permanently in the past tense. I sat through that entire service in silence, watching Verity accept warm, extended applause for a revival built substantially on arrangements I had personally composed, still sung by that very choir that same morning, without a single word connecting those specific pieces back to their own actual composer. I didn't say anything that evening. I sat with that program for a long time after the service ended, understanding with total clarity exactly what I needed to do the following morning. I called my old friend Matilda before I called the church's own music committee, a woman I'd sung alongside for over 3 decades in that same choir, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how much a piece of original music actually mattered to the person who'd written it. I told her the whole story. 3 years of gradual erosion, the anniversary program, my own name reduced to a single past tense sentence. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. Araminta, she finally said, you spent 45 years making certain every single voice in that choir loft got heard clearly, never once letting one voice drown out the rest. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the voice being drowned out this time happens to be your own. I keep waiting to feel guilty about what I'm about to do, I told her, and it isn't coming. Maybe it isn't coming, Matilda said, because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't ask to disappear from your own ministry's story. You're simply refusing to let that disappearance continue one single day longer than it already has. I contacted an attorney the following morning, a sharp woman named Ottavia Renfrew, who specialized in musical copyright matters, explaining plainly what had occurred and confirming the specific status of my own original compositions, still protected under copyright registrations I had filed decades earlier, registrations that had never once been transferred or licensed away to anyone, including the church itself, beyond the informal permission I'd always extended for the choir's own weekly use. Araminta, she said, your copyright status here is clear and entirely in your own favor. You have every legal right to formally withdraw permission for continued use of your own compositions, regardless of how long the church has been using them or how central they've become to the ministry's actual repertoire. Those first few days after the anniversary service were harder than I expected. I found myself, more than once, reaching for the phone to call Ottavia and tell her to hold off, that surely there was some gentler way to make my point without formally withdrawing permission for the repertoire. I sat at my own piano one entire evening, my own original manuscript for that very first arrangement still resting on the stand, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Matilda's words, remembering the actual weight of that folded program, remembering that gentler corrections had already had nearly 3 years to work and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not attempt to have Verity removed from the choir entirely, nor did I seek to damage her standing out of pure anger. Ottavia drafted a formal notice to the church's own music committee and to Verity directly, citing the specific copyright registrations, formally withdrawing permission for continued use of my own original arrangements, effective at the end of the current season, and requiring any future use of those specific pieces to be negotiated through a proper, documented licensing arrangement that accurately credited my own continuing authorship. Anselm called the following morning, his voice tight with confusion rather than his usual calm. Mom, this feels like it could seriously damage the whole choir's repertoire right before the holiday season. I understand that's a real concern, I said calmly, but I sat in a back pew and listened to my own 45 years of work described as something firmly in the past, while that same choir sang my own compositions that very morning without a single word connecting them back to me. I'm not trying to punish the ministry. I'm asking that my own actual authorship of specific pieces be honestly acknowledged, or those pieces simply won't be available for continued use. There has to be another way to handle this that doesn't disrupt the whole repertoire right before Christmas. There is, I said. If Verity is willing to sit down with me and correct the public record honestly, accurately crediting my own compositions in every program and public description going forward, I'm entirely open to reinstating full permission immediately. I'm not interested in punishing the choir I built. I'm interested in making certain my own actual work is never again presented as though it belonged to someone else's revival story. Verity called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Araminta, this is completely unfair. The newsletter and the program language weren't things I personally wrote myself. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who watched you accept warm, extended applause for a revival built substantially on my own compositions without a single word of correction, after nearly 3 years of quietly positioning yourself as the ministry's own central voice. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I actually sat in that back pew and read that program myself. I was only trying to help this ministry feel relevant and growing. I believe that you believe that, I said. But relevance was never meant to require my own actual composed work becoming your personal platform. Those are very different things, Verity, and I think some part of you has always understood the difference, which is exactly why you never once corrected any of those descriptions yourself, even when you had every opportunity to. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then returned to my own quiet home, understanding that whatever came next would take considerable time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Anselm called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's genuine distress over the choir's own uncertain repertoire and a growing understanding of exactly how far the public erasure had actually gone. Marceline, once she heard the whole story, offered to fly in and sit with Anselm directly, walking him through the full timeline the way only a sibling who'd grown up sitting in that same choir loft every single Sunday could properly convey. She told me later that she'd brought recordings of several of our own earliest services, playing them for Anselm directly, watching his face change as he heard, with real attention, exactly how much careful work had gone into building something he'd simply grown up assuming would always exist in that particular form. I don't think he understood how deliberate every single arrangement actually was until he heard you and Dad working through it decades ago, Marceline told me. He kept saying, I always just thought of it as the choir. It was never just the choir, Marceline told him. It was 45 years of one woman composing something on purpose, one careful piece at a time. About 2 weeks after my formal notice went out, Anselm asked if I'd be willing to join a call with him and Verity together, something he described, a little awkwardly, as trying to find a way forward that didn't destroy either the choir's own repertoire or this family's own relationships. I agreed, genuinely hoping we could resolve this honestly. When the call connected, Anselm sat beside Verity at their own kitchen table, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. Mom, Anselm began, we wanted to talk through everything properly, figure out what happens next for all of us. I'm listening, I said. Verity spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. I think I genuinely got swept up in an opportunity that felt bigger than anything I'd ever been offered professionally, especially watching you manage real health struggles. I know accepting that anniversary framing without correcting it was wrong, but withdrawing your entire repertoire right before the holidays Feels like it's designed to punish the whole choir at exactly the wrong moment. Was that the intention? I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop watching 45 years of my own actual composed work get quietly claimed by someone else's growing platform. If it disrupts the repertoire, I understand that it might, it should, a little. 3 years of gradual erasure doesn't undo itself painlessly just because the reason it's ending is a fair one. I could lose real credibility with this entire congregation if the repertoire falls apart right before Christmas, Verity said, her composure cracking slightly. Is that really what you wanted? What I wanted, I said, was to stop being reduced to a single past tense sentence in my own ministry's own program while you became its public face. I never once asked you to stay silent about your own genuine contribution. I only asked from the very beginning that my own actual authorship remain clearly, publicly mine, and somewhere along the way, that condition stopped being honored at all. Anselm was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned toward Verity directly, his voice low but clear enough for me to hear as well. You had the microphone in your own hands at that service, he said. You could have said, "These arrangements are Mom's own compositions." You didn't. I don't understand how nearly 3 years of watching her write and conduct that music herself became something you thought you were entitled to simply absorb as your own revival story. Verity's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire call, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. I don't know how to fix something that started with me genuinely wanting to help revitalize an important ministry, she said, almost to herself. You start by correcting the public record honestly. Every single time it comes up from now on, I told her, starting with the very next service. Given Verity's genuine willingness to correct course honestly, the music committee, Verity, and I worked together to issue a formal correction ahead of the following Sunday service, one that plainly, clearly credited me as the composer of every original arrangement in the choir's own repertoire, with Verity's own genuine contribution as co-director stated honestly and separately, a distinction she herself insisted on repeating, unprompted, in every subsequent service program going forward. About 3 weeks later, Anselm came to see me alone, sitting across me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about all the Sundays growing up, sitting in that choir loft, listening to you and Dad build that entire program from almost nothing, he said. I don't know when I started thinking of it as just the choir instead of understanding it was actually your entire life's calling, built specifically, deliberately, one composition at a time. Thank you for saying that now, I told him. Why didn't you say something sooner before it went this far? Because I kept telling myself it wasn't really about ownership, he said. It was about whether your actual legacy survived being quietly absorbed or got smoothed into something easier to hand off. I think I forgot that a natural transition and a quiet erasure aren't automatically the same thing. Verity came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our earlier call had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually losing this entire ministry role, and how much fear about proving myself drove decisions I'm not proud of, she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Araminta, but some part of this was just about genuinely wanting to build something significant with my own name attached to it, especially after watching you struggle with your health so visibly. That desire is entirely understandable, I told her gently. I never doubted your genuine talent or your ambition. I only ever wanted my own actual authorship of something I built over 45 years to remain clearly, publicly, mine for as long as I'm still actively part of it. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted, about how easily wanting to prove my own capability turned into believing I was entitled to simply absorb something that was never fully mine to claim. I think I convinced myself that a cleaner, solo revival story would make the transition easier for everyone, so I stopped correcting the moments where that narrative started erasing you entirely. You were never entitled to simply absorb this ministry, Verity, I told her. But you were always entitled to ask me directly, honestly, about what a genuinely fair partnership might actually look like. Those are very different paths, and only one of them was ever actually available to you. I don't know how to undo 2 years of building toward that erasure, she said. You don't undo it, I told her. You start correcting it publicly every single time it comes up, and let the story going forward finally be told honestly. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon about Solomon, about the choir loft, about what this ministry had actually been built to carry. I showed her Solomon's own organ tuning notes from decades earlier, alongside my own original manuscript pages for the very first arrangement I'd ever composed for that choir 45 years before. Verity read through those pages slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could help me properly document, for the church's own historical record, exactly how the ministry's actual history unfolded, so any future transition started from complete honesty rather than gradual erosion. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Anselm and Verity began seeing a counselor together that autumn, specifically to address the underlying fear and ambition driving how Verity approached professional recognition within the ministry, something neither of them had properly examined before. Verity told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying how they had approached this professional transition. We both said inevitability almost at the same time, Verity said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called a natural transition actually depended on quietly claiming something that was never simply hers to inherit. I called Atavia a few weeks after the formal notice went out to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the correction had moved forward faster than either of us expected. Araminta, I've handled a lot of these musical copyright disputes over the years, she said, and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a protected composition's ownership I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt, in the moment, more like an act of pure hurt than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You understood, decades ago, exactly how easily a piece of original music can slip away from its rightful composer once someone else starts speaking for it publicly. The fact that you eventually needed to enforce that protection doesn't make you any less careful for having registered it properly in the first place. Marceline flew in for the following spring's considerably more honest service celebrating the ministry's continued growth. Verity herself introducing each original arrangement performed that day by its actual title and composer, describing her own role clearly as the director fortunate enough to now be sharing that legacy actively with me, rather than replacing it. Over the small reception afterward, Marceline's husband, Ignatius, asked, carefully, how the whole situation had eventually settled, having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The room quieted for a moment, the kind of quiet that had become familiar to this family over the past year, before Verity simply said, I let wanting recognition turn into almost erasing the entire history that made this ministry worth being part of at all. Araminta made sure I understood exactly what that would have cost. I'm still working to earn back the trust that cost. Nobody looked away uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Ignatius, genuinely curious rather than unkind, asked Verity how it had felt correcting the record so publicly. Verity was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. "Humbling isn't a strong enough word," she said. "I think I finally understood what it costs someone else when you let ambition replace an honest account of whose work actually built the thing you're standing on." I appreciated that she didn't try to soften the admission for the sake of a pleasant reception. Verity called her own mother that same autumn, correcting, at last, the way she'd absorbed that particular family habit of claiming revival credit rather than honoring continuity. Anselm told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered whether that revival story habit had ever actually cost anyone something real. Watching it modeled her entire life without fully questioning it. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Anselm's or Verity's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a picture of ministry ownership she'd apparently helped normalize without ever fully considering the cost. A few weeks after that service, a card arrived in my mailbox, Anselm's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written considerably more than a few lines. "Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Verity's version of this transition become the only version anyone heard, including me. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actually listen every single time when you tell me something about the ministry feels wrong. Thank you for making certain 45 years of your actual work survive being turned into someone else's fresh revival story." Tucked inside the same envelope was a considerably longer letter in Verity's own handwriting. "Araminta, I spent nearly 3 years building a public identity around a legacy that was never mine to claim as my own solo platform. I'm sorry it took you sitting silently through your own erasure at that anniversary service for me to understand exactly what that claiming actually cost you." I folded both letters carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside Solomon's own organ-tuning notes, a small, permanent record of exactly how seriously that authorship had always needed to be protected. I saw Matilda again that summer, over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd talked through everything the week of that difficult anniversary service. I told her about the correction, the counseling, the honest spring service. Matilda listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. "I told you it would matter, holding that line," she said. "Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually protected. Not just the music, the truth back." I thought about that phrase for days afterward, understanding that it described exactly what had actually been at stake the entire time. "Do you regret any of it?" Matilda asked gently. "The 3 years of gradual erosion before you finally acted?" "I regret the silence," I told her. "I don't regret bringing Verity into the ministry originally, or the family, or even the patience I gave before finally reaching my limit. I think I needed all of it in some strange way to finally understand exactly what I was protecting when I registered those compositions decades ago. I think about that quiet back pew often, the folded program still in my own hands, a single sentence describing my entire life's work as something firmly in the past. At the moment, it felt like the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely, a family finally required to reckon honestly with the legacy it had been quietly editing. I don't regret bringing Verity into that choir loft freely. Anselm's happiness mattered to me then, and it still does. What I regret is how long I allowed 45 years of my own actual work to be quietly repositioned as someone else's fresh start, before I finally insisted the record reflect reality. Music written with genuine care was never meant to require its composer's disappearance as the price of honest succession, and I intend to make certain my own name remains attached to every piece I write for as long as I'm able to compose anything at all. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet generosity was itself sufficient protection, that a good mother-in-law simply trusted her family's ambitions without ever needing anything formally enforced to protect her own actual legacy underneath them. I no longer believe that. Trusting shared understanding to protect itself isn't sufficient. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of erosion, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to formally protect what actually matters. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The newsletter language describing fresh vision, the talks given to visiting educators without my knowledge, the diocese feature that reduced 45 years to a single footnote. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that the anniversary program was an isolated lapse rather than the culmination of nearly 3 years of careful, escalating repositioning. Verity may not have consciously planned each individual step, but the cumulative effect served a purpose she understood on some level, even if she never named it to herself. Keeping my own ongoing authorship small enough that a cleaner, more marketable solo narrative could take its place. Real succession, I've come to believe, was never actually about choosing between honoring a legacy and building genuine opportunity for the next person carrying it forward. It was about protecting both, clearly and simultaneously, rather than letting one quietly absorb the other, because absorption felt more convenient in an uncertain moment. If a collaborator needs you to disappear from your own life's work in order to build a cleaner public platform, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves an immediate, direct response, not a patient wait-and-see approach. I think of it now the way I used to think about a single voice in the choir quietly drowned out by everyone singing louder around it. You can let that happen if you want to. It never once makes the whole piece sound better. It only continues, quietly, until someone finally insists that particular voice be heard again. I think sometimes about all those years in that choir loft, learning that every honest piece of music depends on the actual person who composed it remaining clearly, audibly credited for it. It took me 76 years and one very quiet Sunday in a back pew to apply that same standard fully to my own life's work. I welcomed Verity into that ministry freely, and I would welcome a genuine collaborator again exactly the same way. But I no longer accept a version of succession that requires my own disappearance from something I built over 4.5 decades. If I am the one who composed that music, I intend to remain the one whose name it carries, not because I distrust everyone who helps me, but because pretending otherwise was never generosity. It was only ever a kindness to someone else's more convenient platform, purchased at the cost of my own life's actual work. The choir sings every Sunday now, exactly the way it always should have, Verity always asking me directly now, before any program description or public event connected to it. Exactly how I'd like a particular piece credited, rather than assuming any framing remains hers to decide alone. Marceline flew in specially for one of the ministry's recent milestone services, standing near the choir loft's own railing with genuine warmth on her face. Watching Verity ask me, plainly, whether a particular new arrangement she wanted to introduce actually felt right to add before she committed to programming it at all. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for nearly 3 years. I am 76 years old, a widow, a retired choir director who never quite managed full retirement, a mother and grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly trusts her own life's work to remain hers, simply because it should, without ever formally protecting that ownership herself. That particular version of me stayed behind in a quiet back pew, along with a single folded program that introduced my own 45 years of composed work as something firmly, permanently in the past. I sat in that pew that evening as one woman, and I stood up as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently. If given the chance to go back to the day I first brought Verity into that choir loft, knowing everything I know now, I tell them the truth. I would welcome her again, exactly the same way, because her genuine talent and her initial excitement about the ministry were never the mistake. The mistake was assuming that a formal understanding alone would naturally protect something as specific and essential as my own continued authorship of a legacy I'd spent 45 years building, that decades of careful, deliberate composition could survive on their own weight without anyone occasionally insisting it be honored directly, in public, when it actually mattered most. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the trust I extended. It would be the 3 years of small corrections I let slide, corrections I mistook again and again for graciousness rather than what they actually were, a slow and quiet surrender of my own life's actual authorship. Marceline's own daughter asked me once, sitting beside me at the piano during a visit, whether it had been hard to keep composing new arrangements even after everything that happened with Verity. I told her honestly that it had been, that some weeks I'd wondered whether writing anything new was worth the risk of it eventually being claimed by someone else's story. But I kept writing anyway, I told her, because the alternative was letting fear decide what I created, and I'd already spent 45 years refusing to let anything but genuine care decide that. She asked if she could learn to play one of the pieces herself, and I spent that entire afternoon teaching her the simplest arrangement I'd ever written, watching her work through it slowly, understanding that passing the actual music itself into careful, willing hands mattered even more than any credit line ever could. My own grandchildren ask me now, whenever they visit the choir loft, to tell them the real story behind the music, not the polished promotional version, but the actual history underneath it, the 6 borrowed hymnals, the decades of careful composition, the difficult year its own future nearly got quietly rewritten without me. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete, no detail softened, no chapter left unspoken, watching them absorb a history that finally, completely belongs to the woman who actually composed every single piece of it. These days, when anyone asks about the arrangements still sung in that choir loft every Sunday, they hear the whole story, the 6 borrowed hymnals, the decades of genuine growth, a difficult year that nearly rewrote the whole thing before honesty finally, deliberately won out. I'm simply, finally, exactly as present in my own life's work as I always should have been.